Okay. Can everyone see the share screen at home? Good.
Yep.
Yes.
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 Okay, we're back to live. I hope everyone has been safe. We got a lot to do. I don't know if you guys have you gotten copies yet of the major exam schedule?
No.
No.
So apparently we're going to do, assuming we're open, we're going to do an exam prior to Thanksgiving. And the school is going to be closed down after Thanksgiving. No one's going to be able to come back and do live classes. And so the dean is going to have everyone in the major courses give an exam before the week before Thanksgiving. So I haven't seen it yet, but I think ours is either going to be the week of Thanksgiving or the week before Thanksgiving. So I will, as soon as I get that information, I will let you know. I'm told
Professor?
that it's been released.
Professor, it came out yesterday, and I was a little confused because I thought we had no midterms for this course, but it seems now.
It's not a midterm. There's only gonna, it's in the last couple of weeks of classes anyways.
No,
So
we have. It says we have one for October, one for November, and an exam.
No, we don't have a midterm. I give you guys a quiz every week, but there will be one right before Thanksgiving.
And one after and one.
No, just one.
No, then there'll be a smaller one after Thanksgiving.
Oh,
because we
really?
still have classes.
I haven't looked at, oh my
Yeah.
God.
So no memo or anything came out with it. It was just
Yes, it came out yesterday.
Did a memo come out explaining it?
Eunice, where did that come from?
Where'd you get it? I didn't see
Hey,
anything.
I can only listen to one person at a time. Okay, so please, if someone's talking, just wait until they're done. Yes, we're all going to be required in these classes, in the 1Ls and 2Ls major courses, to give an exam right before Thanksgiving. That's going to comprise the bulk of the class. Then for the 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, there won't be any live classes, and you will get a very, very small exam or an assignment. That's what I've been told. Have any other professors discussed this with you? Yeah? Okay, good.
Can I ask? When-
No, and I didn't hear what
So-
Eunice said, but it's a shocker.
So it's being done so that we can have a live exam. I think the administration's point with not coming back after Thanksgiving is a valid one. It's not safe to send people out to Thanksgiving spots all around the East Coast and then come back into school. One of the worst things you can be doing is traveling. So the thought is that live classes are going to end. And this is how we can get one live exam in for those who can take live exams. That's my understanding of the rationale. Teddy? So Teddy asked, what about the minor courses like healthcare law and things like that? I teach landlord tenant, and I have not been told that I have to give one in landlord tenant. It's the major courses that that they're going to be doing it for, is my understanding of it.
Can I ask?
Karen?
Yeah. So when you say after Thanksgiving, it's going to be no live, is that mean everything is just going to be audio remote, or we don't even have audio remote?
No, that means everything will be, for me, I will just do my Zooms like I did the last 2 weeks.
Okay, so it might
So we'll
vary. Okay.
continue to do those, okay? And I assume that's what the other professors will do, but they'll just do them remotely instead of doing them from a classroom. Okay?
Got it. Thank you. It's not much
Okay.
different for us.
So, look, I don't know the full story of this either. So I'm giving you what information I have. When I get more information, as in dates and things like that, I will certainly let you know, okay? Quite frankly, I'm gonna be very surprised if we make it to Thanksgiving to be able to take these tests live. I just, you know, the numbers are already starting to go up in places in Massachusetts. And so I think, you know, at some point, we may well be closing down. They're now talking that the fall is going to be very, very bad. So, you know, we'll just take it as it comes, guys. That's all we can do. Okay. All right. Let's go on to the tax and spend power. So, you know, again, we're in Article 1, Section 8. We're looking at legislative power. We found legislative power mentioned so far in the Commerce Clause. We also have mentioned in a couple of spots, and we'll be talking about that even more so later today. We mentioned that Congress has some power through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in order to pass legislation. We talked about that when we did the Katzenbach case and the Heart of Atlanta case, essentially trying to, you know, figure out why the heck didn't Congress use its authority under discrimination powers as opposed to commerce power to deal with discrimination. And today you're going to start to find out. So now we're going to look at the taxing and spending powers. And interestingly, I think what we'll do at the end of the discussion on the tax power is talk about if the federal government wanted to do a big unified approach to the pandemic, would the federal government have the power to do that? And I think what we've been talking about is that if you think of the pandemic as dealing with health and safety of people, that's part of the police power that's reserved to the states, right? That is not enumerated power, it's police power that's reserved to the states. And what we've already mentioned is that the federal government has no police power. So the federal government cannot just, you know, legislate for the safety and health of people. It's supposed to leave that up to the states to deal with those kinds of laws. But then you interestingly here have the tax and spend law, which reads a little bit differently from the Commerce Clause. So here it is, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay all the debts and provide for the common defense. Okay, here's some important language. Provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. There is no police power for the federal government, but this is as close as it comes, folks. They can spend and they can tax to provide for the general welfare. So in other words, can the federal government provide for the general welfare through the Commerce Clause? And the answer is no, because there's no general welfare language in the Commerce Clause. So to the extent that the federal government wants to provide for the general welfare of the United States, it has to do so through this taxing and spending power. And that's what we're going to examine here. When we're going to see that, you know, originally it was construed very narrowly until 1937 when things changed. So here's United States versus Butler. Remember, you know, every little case has its own history, and every little case in the Supreme Court is part of the history of the United States and is usually in reaction to something that has occurred in history. And if we're looking at 1936, we're looking at the Great Depression in the United States, 1929 to essentially late 1941 when Pearl Harbor was bombed. What really got us out of the Great Depression was getting into World War II. So here you have 1936. And remember what Roosevelt is doing, all right? We have a worldwide economic crisis. The economists have figured out that you will never solve it on a state-by-state basis. Large problems, international problems, require at least national responses. And so Roosevelt is doing everything he can to, evoke a national response that will help with the downturn in the economy. And so a lot of these measures that we're going to be talking about come from the Great Depression. Now, I've mentioned this before, I'm going to mention it again. 1937 is a big year for con law students. In 1937, the Supreme Court changed and started to construe congressional power very broadly, okay? Up until then, remember the laissez-faire era that we talked about, back when we talked about the Commerce Clause? Laissez-faire essentially came to an end in 1937. At least in the eyes of the law, it came to an end in 1937, okay? So look at the date of this case, 1936. 1937 is the magic year. So what happens in United States versus Butler? Something similar to what we saw back when we did the Commerce Clause. In 1933, the Agriculture Adjustment Act basically decided to punish farmers who grew too many crops and reward those who didn't. So, some would get payments made to them if they agreed not to exceed their acreage quota. And those who did exceed it would have to pay a penalty. Then a tax was laid on the crops that the wholesalers and producers paid in order to fund the whole program. And so then the question here is, may Congress use its taxing and spending powers to operate this type of a program? And the court here says no. This is economic coercion. You're penalizing farmers not to produce crops. Once again, this flies in the face of laissez-faire economics. The literal translation, let it be, leave it alone, is laissez-faire. And the Supreme Court just isn't there yet, isn't ready to accept where Roosevelt is going here. Okay, so this is essentially a product of laissez-faire. And you see, okay, this can't be squared with Wickard versus Filburn. Anyone remember the date? 1941. That comes after 1947. I'm not good at math, but I know that 1941 comes after 1937. Okay, so obviously different approaches that the court is coming in with. Now all of a sudden, here we are in 1937, and we have Stewart Machine Company versus Davis. This is an unemployment compensation scheme that the federal government comes up with. The federal government wants the states to come up with their own unemployment compensation schemes. I don't know if any of you know how unemployment compensation works, but it's largely run through the state. And employers have to buy unemployment insurance, and you pay a premium for it. And then if you lay somebody off, your premiums will go up because they're going to get paid through the insurer. So it's kind of a disincentive to lay people off. It's now, from my understanding, almost entirely run through the states. But here there was no such thing as unemployment compensation. Remember, there was no safety net before the Great Depression. There was no Social Security that you collected when you retired. There was no Medicare, there was no Medicaid. The government just wasn't involved at all in those types of things. So the federal government wants to try to get the states into dealing with unemployment compensation. So it says, look, if your employer contributes into a plan, we're gonna charge you, a certain amount. If your employer contributes into this plan, participates and contributes in it, you're going to get back 90% of the money that you pay in. And so the whole idea here is to try to get all the states online to start taking over this unemployment compensation. And the federal government will provide the money to be able to do that. And as I've said, it's pretty much become, even though it's administered through the state, it's pretty much become privatized through insurance companies these days. This time, the Supreme Court looks at this very, very differently, tax and spend. You're getting taxed in order to contribute to an unemployment fund for people who get laid off, lose their jobs, and then the government is spending some money as an incentive for the states to participate in these, and is willing to pick up 90% of the tab in the early years. I don't know how much the government contributes these days. You know who does? Has anyone taken an elective with Professor Armano yet? He's done some of this type of stuff. So he would know more about it. Finally, we have, well, not finally, because we're gonna hit Obamacare one more time. But before we get there, we get the Sabri versus United States case. These are opportunity zones in cities. The federal government is dispensing money to cities so that they can revitalize neighborhoods and try to get some good housing in for people who had been pretty much shut out of that. And of course, you know, the cities will take this and work with real estate developers to come in and either rehab or build new housing for these folks. And Mr. Sabri, unfortunately, seemed to think that a major part of doing business and getting awarded government contracts was to bribe members of the Minneapolis City Council. And he got caught doing this. He was charged with a federal crime because Congress set it up to say, essentially, if we're going to give money to these cities, we want to make sure that it's spent on valid things, not that it's spent on corruption, so to say. He says, well, you can't show that the money that came in from the federal government was at all involved in this deal, because it all kind of gets mixed together. How do you know which dollar, you know, is being spent? And the court says that's ridiculous. Money is liquid. It's fungible. It all, you know, it all goes into one pool. And it's perfectly reasonable for the government, the federal government, if it's going to spend money on items, to make sure that the money is spent wisely. So it upholds the scheme. Now, this next section of the taxing and spending power, and really as much as as much spending power as anything else, is the part that you're going to be tested on the most on the bar exam. That is my experience with looking at these bar exam questions. If the federal government is going to spend money on either the states or on individual projects with private people to promote the general welfare, the question becomes, can it attach conditions to the funds? Okay. And the general answer we're going to say is yes. And the big case is South Dakota versus Dole. These pictures look like there might be some students now at BU, huh? Did you guys hear about that? They just suspended a whole bunch of students at BU because I guess they went to this area on campus called the Grotto, and they had this huge party, and everyone got COVID and was passing it around. And they're doing massive suspensions. Kind of interesting. You guys were all college students. You invite a bunch of 18, 19-year-old college students back to campus, and then you punish them for acting like college students. I mean, it's just kind of wild to me. Yeah, I mean, that's, and then they seem to want to be, yeah, they're just going to lose a half a year's tuition. They're going to use the, yeah. Yeah, NB is about 65 grand a year now. So you can tell me all about college tuition. It was cheap when I went. It wasn't when my kids went. So I can tell you that.
I
So,
went there, I think it was
but
20.
what's that?
I went there when I think it was only 20,000 back in
Huh.
the 80s.
Yeah, well, I went to a state university and paid $2,500 to live there. And I paid for my own law school, and the tuition was about $6 grand back then. And I mostly paid for that by painting houses in the summertime. So it was what you guys face today is just wrong to you know, level that much debt on anyone. I think it's just wrong. It's too much money. What's that? I was a house painter. There you go. Among other things, I was a landscaper in college and a house painter in law school. So there you go. Don't anyone ask me to get on a 40-foot ladder these days. It would scare the hell out of me, but I used to climb up the top of one very, very easily back in the day. Not anymore. Well, there you go. So this is, well, since we're talking college age, when I went to college, the drinking age was 18. And let's see, my wife is one of 4 girls, and she's the second. By the time the last one came to be 18 years old, the drinking age had gone up to 21. And what happened was the federal government wanted all the states to raise their drinking age to 21. And you guys all know that the federal government dispenses highway funds under this spending power that we're talking about. So, you know, if you drive up 93 in New Hampshire, a lot of those construction dollars are federal dollars, obviously. The Big Dig was obviously a lot of federal dollars as well. So what the federal government does is it says, look, we're giving you these highway funds, and the states really come to rely on the highway funds. We're giving you these highway funds, but we're going to keep 5% of them, withhold 5% of your highway funds if you don't raise the drinking age to 21 years of age, okay? Now, if this were done under the Commerce Clause, we know that would violate the anti-commandeering provisions that we just talked about, I think, in the last class, right? You can't essentially take over a state legislature and make them pass a law. But we're not talking about the Commerce Clause. We're talking about the spending power. The federal government is giving money to all the states, including South Dakota, and is saying, but here's the deal. We think that too many kids are getting killed on the highway because of drinking and driving. And therefore, if you don't raise the drinking age, we're only going to give you 95% of the funds this year, okay? And the federal government has done this with highway funds in other circumstances. Used to be, when I was a kid growing up, there'd be billboards right up in the side of the roads, right? Now you can't put a billboard, I think it's within 300 feet of an interstate highway, because you'll lose some of your highway funds if you allow billboards to go that close to the highway, because they were considered to be distractions. So South Dakota kind of liked its law. It allowed people to buy low alcohol beer once they were 19 years old. And the federal government said no, and so we have this lawsuit between South Dakota and the Secretary of Transportation, Elizabeth Dole, who was served during the Reagan administration and was the wife of Bob Dole, the Senator Bob Dole from Kansas. So the majority opinion says, and this is the theory of spending. The government can attach a condition that we'll see in a minute that's reasonable to your receipt of the funds, okay? And it gives you a choice. You can choose to leave the drinking age at 19, or you can choose to raise the drinking age to 21. But if you don't raise the drinking age to 21, if you refuse to submit to our condition, then you're going to lose some of the highway funds that we're going to give you. You know, if we're going to spend the money on you, we want to make sure that we think you're going to spend it wisely. And that's generally allowable, even though it wouldn't be under the Commerce Clause, again, under the anti-commandeering decisions. You know, the New York versus United States, the Prince case, okay? You can't commandeer a legislature or a public official under the anti-commandeering provisions. When it comes to spending, you can say, hey, either you raise the drinking age to 21 or you're going to get a little bit less this year when we pass out our highway dollars. And we're advancing the general welfare. We're spending for the general welfare. And Congress gets pretty broad discretion when it gets to spend on the general welfare. Now, here's the, oops, I see a typo in there. Here's the, I can fix that right now. How do you like that? Here's the dissent. And the law sometimes makes strange bedfellows. Sandra Day O'Connor was what I'll call a moderate conservative justice appointed by Ronald Reagan. And Justice William Brennan was a very, very liberal, one of the most activist judges to ever serve on the court. But they agree on this issue and they dissent. And they say this: there has to be a nexus between the condition and the purpose for spending the money. And the nexus has to have a fairly direct connection. So what they're arguing here is, look, you're not taking this 5% away. That money is not being devoted to, say, youth education driving programs to teach people about the, the horrors of drunk driving and the like. Instead, it's just general highway funds that get, pretty much left to the state to spend however they want. So what you're doing is you're imposing a condition that's related to drunk driving, but that's not close enough to the general condition of the highway, which is what most of the states are going to spend the money on. So they would have wanted a tighter fit, a more direct connection between the condition and the purpose of spending the money. And they thought it was just too loose a connection in this case. And then they had another reason, and we're not going to talk about this very often in this class, but the 21st Amendment ended the prohibition. The 19th Amendment was the prohibition. The 21st Amendment ended the prohibition. When the 21st Amendment, did I say 21st? When the 21st Amendment.
You did.
Stupid me. When the 21st Amendment was ratified, it said essentially that all the liquor laws shall be left up to the individual states. And there's the language right there: transportation or importation into any state, territory, or possession of the United States for delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws thereof is hereby prohibited. So in other words, the federal government ceded the ability to deal with alcohol to the states. And O'Connor and Brennan are saying, well, this is a matter involving alcohol, and I don't think we have the federal authority to take that power from them and tell them that they have to increase the drinking age to 21. So what this case stands for is two things. One is that the federal government, when it spends for the general welfare, can attach conditions to achieve the general welfare. And it's got broad discretion as to what the general welfare is. And two, even though they were wrong, there's an acknowledgement that there does have to be a relationship, a nexus, between the condition and the purpose for which the money is spent. The disagreement comes with how loose that nexus can be. The majority says it can be pretty loose, as long as it's generally related, even indirectly related. The dissent is saying, no, it has to be a tighter relationship, an almost direct relationship is what they're looking for. And our third and final time, National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius, Obamacare case. One more time. This time we're going to talk about it in regard to taxing and spending. Now remember what the chief did when we looked at this case the first two times. One, and I'm going to go not in the way they were presented in the course, but in the way they were presented in the case itself. One is Roberts says there is no congressional authority to impose the individual mandate. At least under the Commerce Clause, there's no authority to impose the individual mandate. And the reason for that is because commerce power only relates to some pre-existing economic activity. It does not relate to non-activity. And what you are doing here, Congress, is forcing someone who's doing nothing into buying insurance so that you can then regulate them under the power of the Commerce Clause, and that's stretching the Commerce Clause too far. Then the backup argument was, well, yeah, but within the Necessary and Proper Clause, we can stretch the Commerce Clause to cover this. And he says, no, you can't. Necessary and proper power is derivative power, must be derived from one of the other powers. And there must be fairly directly derived from one of the other powers, and you're just, going out of bounds here. So now what we're looking at is Roberts turning around and saying, aha, I'm still going to save the Affordable Care Act. We're still going to save the individual mandate. And here's how we're going to do it. Who is it that collects the penalties? Oh, it's the IRS. And how do the penalties work? Every year when you do your income taxes, you get a form from your health insurance company that says that you had purchased qualifying health insurance. And if you don't get that form from your health insurance company, the information of which you have to put onto your tax return, the IRS is going to make you pay a tax. Of course, the statute talks in terms of penalties, not in terms of taxes, but it's administered through the IRA, and it is collected at the time that you pay your taxes. And it can greatly reduce the amount of the tax refund that you get, okay? And so Robert says, look, this is totally valid. Under the taxing clause, this is totally valid. First of all, they're taxing to raise revenue, and the revenue is going to be so that people who can't afford insurance are going to be able to participate in an expanded Medicaid, and that's for the general welfare. So we can do that. And taxes are required to raise revenue, and this is raising revenue. So we can do that. Congress can do that. And just because the tax is related to social policy doesn't mean that Congress can't do it. Indeed, if anyone here is a smoker and you buy a pack of cigarettes in Massachusetts, you're going to end up paying probably a lot more in taxes than you pay for the cigarettes themselves. And why is that? It's a so-called sin tax. The government is all the time putting taxes on activities that might not be good for you. Think about this. Is it good for the United States economy for the population to grow? Yes. So what do they do for you on your tax return? They give you a deduction for having children to encourage you to have children. By the way, they cost a hell of a lot more than the deduction that you get, the child credit that you get. a hell of a lot more. We just talked about college. Does the government want you to own your own home? Yes, they do. So what do? They give you a mortgage interest deduction, right? So does the government want you to drink too much alcohol? No, because what's going to happen? Your health is going to slip, and then the government's going to have to end up paying more in health care for you. So what does it do? It taxes alcohol. It puts a sin tax on alcohol. Okay, so the government has been doing this for a long time. Robert says that's fine. Taxes that influence conduct are nothing new. Every tax has some regulatory purpose. It's perfectly fine. However, even though he's just saved the individual mandate, there's one more part of Obamacare that he had to address. I just mentioned to you that one of the things that the Affordable Care Act did was expand Medicaid. Medicaid is a federal health program for people who are indigent, people who don't make enough money. In Massachusetts, all of these are administered through the states, but most of the money comes from the federal government. In Massachusetts, it's called Mass Health. Mass Health is essentially Medicaid, okay? My wife, our youngest son is a special needs adult, and he qualifies for Mass Health. In order to expand Medicaid, you know, we're gonna have to remember this concept of the pool that I talked about before. We're gonna have to make sure that people who are low risk get into the pool, so we can keep down the costs of it. And in order to do this, the states have to set up an expanded Medicaid program. So it says to the states, in order to get this health care money, this Medicaid money, you're going to have to set up an expanded Medicaid program. We're going to initially cover 100% of the cost. Eventually, we're going to decrease it to 90% of the cost, okay? Now, if some of you are old enough to remember, and I'm sure that almost all of you remember the political fire that surrounded the Affordable Care Act. A lot of the states didn't want to expand their Medicaid programs. Typically, states that had Republican governors and legislatures did not want to, for political reasons and a whole host of reasons. So that part of it is challenged as well, because guess what the penalty is? We've already talked about how if you condition money on doing a certain act, that's okay, right? But guess how much of the Medicare funds each state would lose if it didn't sign up for the expected Medicaid expansion? 100%, okay? Now remember, in South Dakota versus Dole, it was 5% you would lose. But here we're talking about losing 100% of the Medicaid funds. And Robert says too much. That's going too far. That's not a reasonable condition. It is too punitive. He uses even stronger language than that. He goes and he notes how much the states have come to rely on these Medicaid funds. Some of them, I think I have the statistics. Yeah, here we go. For many states, it's 20% of the entire state's budget. It's usually 50 to 83% of all the healthcare costs in the state. What he says this is economic dragooning. It's holding a gun to the head of the state. If they don't participate, they lose all of the federal funding, and that's just too much to ask for them. It's really not a choice. And so he said this is not a reasonable condition. Okay. So here on this final slide of tax and spend, I've just sort of done a recap for you guys. Look that stuff over. We've mentioned all of these things already, but I think it's a good thing for you to review before you take Thursday's quiz. Would be a good slide for you guys to review. Actually, the quiz that I'll make available on Thursday, not the one that you have to turn in on Thursday. Look, let's come back to the pandemic for just a minute. Congress can't pass a bill that says every single state, every single state has to pass a law that requires public mask wearing, that requires when numbers hit a certain, benchmark, that they have to issue stay-at-home orders, and they have to enforce these rules through various methods, because that would violate the anti-dragooning provisions of the Commerce Clause. So Congress can't do that under the Commerce Clause. What Congress could do, however, is Congress could pass a relief act, and it could condition receipt of some of the money on meeting these benchmarks, essentially bribe the states into enforcing the the social distancing and mask wearing rules and that type of thing. Okay, so if the federal government wanted to do that, it would probably have to do it through the spending provision, not through the Commerce Clause. Okay. I've got a multiple choice question here for you. Assume that following the Supreme Court's decision in Lopez, remember that's the no gun in the school zone law. Congress created another gun-free school zone act that worked a bit differently. This time, it required that that unless states receiving federal education funds pass laws prohibiting possession of a gun within 1,000 feet of a school, they would lose 5% of their federal education funds. Is this law constitutional? A, no, because Congress may not do indirectly through the spending power what it cannot do directly through the Commerce Clause. B, no, because given the dependence of state and local governments on federal education funds, any such condition by definition would be coercive. C, yes, because the purpose of the condition ensuring school safety is sufficiently related to the purpose of the funds, assuring that the states provide adequate education. Or D, yes, because Congress may determine what constitutes the general welfare for spending. Anyone going to speak in favor of A?
No.
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 Anyone want to speak in favor of B?
No.
No.
5% is not too much. Probably 10% is not too much. The Sebelius case was extreme, 100% of health spending from the federal government when it's such a large portion. And I don't know. There is no bright line rule as to what's too much, what's coercive in violation of Sebelius. We haven't really reached a point of what that might be in Supreme Court jurisprudence. But 5% and 10% is generally fine. Okay, that's not too coercive. Anyone want to speak in favor of C?
Yes.
Yes.
C.
Okay, so far C looks like it has it. Anyone want to speak in favor of D? D is correct, but for the most part, D is a correct statement, but it doesn't go far enough in giving you enough law to answer the question posed. The question posed obviously is around the condition that's imposed. And D doesn't even answer whether the condition is coercive or not, or whether there's a nexus between the condition and the purpose of the spending. And the only one that does that is C. C as in cat. So C is your best answer. Okay? All right. Congress's powers under the post-war amendments. So At times, it looks like we're going to start to wander into individual rights, which is the second half of the semester. You know, individual rights such as free speech, free exercise of religion, the right to receive equal protection of the laws, the right to engage in so-called fundamental rights. These are all individual liberties. And we're going to start to talk about them a little bit, but we're going to do so within the framework of congressional power. So remember what we're saying here is, when is Congress authorized to pass a law? We learned under the Commerce Clause, they're authorized to pass a law. And there's three versions of the Commerce Clause: the Foreign Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, and the Indian Commerce Clause. And it's got power under all of those. We learned about the taxing and spending power just now. And now we're going to talk a little bit about power under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the so-called post-Civil War amendments. Although technically, at least when Congress passed the 13th Amendment, it hadn't been ratified yet, but when Congress passed it, the Civil War was winding down, but still going on. It was pretty much assured, well, it was ensured by that point who was going to win. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 13th Amendment has a provision that makes it clear that it applies to private conduct, not just state conduct, okay? The 14th Amendment is known mostly because of the Equal Protection Clause, which says, you know, which was quite frankly enacted to make sure that former slaves got the equal protection of the laws and were not discriminated against by Jim Crow laws and the like. Obviously, as you're going to see very quickly here that the 14th Amendment was essentially taken off the shelf within a decade of it having been ratified, and wasn't used again until 100 years later, essentially. And then the 15th Amendment was to provide that there be no discrimination in the voting booth, that former slaves would have the right to vote. Now, of all of these, the one that you're going to see the most is the 14th Amendment. Long ago, you know, we purported to end slavery, and no one, in the literal sense, on a large basis, has maintained slavery. I understand there are some arguments that there's this sort of underground child slave pornography sex thing going on. But you know, nothing as widespread as slavery that existed as an economic institution in this country. So the 14th Amendment is going to be the one that we look at the most. Each of these amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, has a final provision that gives enforcement power to Congress. So for the 14th Amendment, it is Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. And what that says is Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And the 13th, 14th Amendments read very, very similarly. There might be one word different, but they're essentially, they all say the same thing. And we believe that the intention was to give broad power to Congress to make sure that these amendments have clout. What has happened instead is that the Supreme Court has read them very, very narrowly, and has really taken out big chunks of the authority of Congress to deal with, you know, anti-discrimination matters, okay? And then you couple the fact that the Supreme Court has taken much power away from the enforcement clauses with the very first clause of Section 1 of the 14th Amendments. And this is really where the individual rights are created in the 14th Amendment. And what are the first three words you say there? You see right there? No state shall make and enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, okay? So the Supreme Court has construed that literally, saying that the 14th Amendment only applies to the states, to, governmental units. And we'll see later on that the Supreme Court eventually came to apply the 14th Amendment to the federal government as well. We're going to talk about something called incorporation later on. So, in other words, what we're going to see the court doing here is saying that the 14th and 15th Amendments do not apply to private discrimination. A hotel owner in Atlanta who happens to name his hotel the Heart of Atlanta Hotel, he won't allow persons of color to stay there. Okay, you can't use the 14th Amendment because that hotel owner is a private citizen, not the state of Georgia, or not a political subdivision of the state of Georgia, okay? This is why we had to use the Commerce Clause in the Heart of Atlanta Hotel. This is why we had to use the Commerce Clause in Katzenbach versus McClung, the Ollie's Barbecue in Katzenbach versus McClung, okay? So in 1875, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act, and it's really a public accommodation law. It says any place that's a public accommodation that people can go into, and it'll list them here, inns, theaters, places of public amusement, any places that's public, has to be available to everyone regardless of race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. Seems to be directly, in congruence with Section 5 of the 14th and 15th Amendments, except for one thing, is that it clearly doesn't apply only to the states. It clearly applies to public facilities. And so the Supreme Court in the civil rights cases in 1883 comes in and says, first of all, you can't use the 13th Amendment because the 13th Amendment only abolishes slavery, and discrimination is not slavery, it's discrimination. Second of all, you can't use the 14th and 15th Amendments because there's no state action in these cases at all. It's not the states who are allegedly doing the discrimination. It was private individuals. And the civil rights cases set up what we call the state action doctrine, is that individual rights are enforced against the states, not against private persons. To a large degree, to the extent that you want to bring anti-discrimination charges or have laws that prevent discrimination, they should be done by the states, is the rationale of the Supreme Court at this time. Not a rationale that worked very well in the 50s and 60s in the South when the Jim Crow laws were being enforced, right? When the federal government decided to become involved and had to use, as we saw, the Commerce Clause for authority. Now, the civil rights cases literally are reaffirmed in 2000. You remember U.S. versus Morrison, and you remember we saw that there was no commerce power for the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. And so therefore, the woman who was allegedly raped did not have a cause of action because Congress didn't have the authority to give her one under the Commerce Clause. So one of the other arguments of the government was, well, okay, not under the Commerce Clause, but under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. discrimination against women is protected by the Equal Protection Clause. Congress has the right to pass laws to, enforce the purposes of the 14th Amendment. And so that should be available here. And again, the court's taking a very narrow interpretation of Section 5 and is saying, no, even though Congress has broad power to enforce, it's only broad power to enforce against the states, not against private individuals. And so they continue to read this in the same way. Katzenbach versus Morgan and Morgan is a quick departure, not for long. This is a Justice Brennan opinion. I think it's here for historical reasons. It's essentially overruled. Here, New York apparently, the state of New York apparently imposed literacy tests meant for the, allegedly at least, meant for the purpose of providing the right to vote for people who could not read or write English, couldn't speak English. And it was claimed that this was aimed at the burgeoning Puerto Rican population in New York. And at that point, the Supreme Court had not declared literacy tests to be unconstitutional. So Congress passes this law, and Justice Brennan says, yeah, we can use we can use Section 5 of the 14th Amendment here. The strong language that he uses, a positive grant of legislative power authorizing Congress to exercise its discretion in determining the need for and nature of legislation to secure 14th Amendment guarantees. Later on, that case would be curtailed, not overruled in name, but certainly in effect. City of Bourne versus Flores. Congress passes something called RFRA, R-F-R-A, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. We're going to talk about this law again when we talk about the Free Exercise Clause, the right to exercise one's religion. And the big case that came down not too long ago is the Hobby Lobby case. And that was essentially a RFRA case as well. But here, the RFRA is declared unconstitutional as it is applied by the states. The Hobby Lobby case, the court doesn't declare it unconstitutional because it involves a federal law. Once again, the Affordable Care Act, not these state zoning laws. So RFRA gives religious organizations the right to challenge local zoning laws and the like that they say interfere with their practice of religion. Different times back then, the San Antonio Catholic Church was growing at the time. Obviously, before the church sex scandal that caused the Catholic Church to shrink in numbers in more recent years. So the church was prohibited from expanding to deal with its growing population. It sues, saying there's a violation of RFRA, and in a direct, a fairly direct attack on Justice Brennan's case in Katzenbach versus Morgan and Morgan. Justice Kennedy writes this decision and essentially says that RFRA is going too far. It is interpreting the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment far more broadly than the First Amendment does. Therefore, Congress lacked the authority under the enforcement provisions of the 14th Amendment to do this. And the court, as you guys know from what case was the very first case we ever did? Marbury versus Madison. Who gets to decide what the Constitution says? Supreme Court. Can Congress decide it doesn't like the interpretation and come up with another one? No, and that's the basis of Kennedy's decision here, is that you're taking you're essentially stretching the meaning of the enforcement provisions too far. So this effectively overrules Katzenbach. And now our final, is this our final case in this area? Yeah, it is. Good. I'm gonna have a chance to actually start the 11th Amendment today. Okay. You guys may or may not remember when this case came down. It's 2013, which is 7 years ago, but boy, it sure doesn't seem that long to me. When it came down, it was all over the news. In 1964, when LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was the president, a former segregationist from Texas, who became one of the true, I guess, champions of the civil rights era. He pushed through Congress the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And we still have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 today. And Congress, and it was done under the Commerce Clause, not under, Section 5. The whole idea was to try to improve the then very poor discrimination situation that existed in the United States. Most of the southern states were still engaging in Jim Crow, still engaging in segregation and discrimination. This was viewed as being very important. Then the following year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what both of these did to a large degree was say, hey, you know what? We're not going to treat all the states and all the counties the same. Because there are some states and some counties where racial discrimination has been historic and systemic. And those are the ones that we need to clean up as soon as we possibly can. And so what it did with, I guess, in 9 different states, a number of counties in 9 different states were targeted, and they were told that they had to go through a pre-clearance mechanism before it could change its voting laws. So you guys know that every 10 years, for example, the census is done. It's being done this year, right? And when the census is done, sometimes there has to be redistricting, which means a redrawing of the congressional district lines. And a lot of states had a history of redrawing them to disenfranchise the black vote, to give the, to dilute the black vote. And we talked about that a little bit before we did the political question doctrine. We saw the difference between racial gerrymandering and political gerrymandering. And the court will not get involved with political gerrymandering. So, and the pre-qualification, the pre-clearance program was supposed to lapse in 5 years, but Congress kept renewing it and eventually renewed it, I think through 2030 something, the last go around. So Shelby County is challenging this. It changes its voting laws. It doesn't want to get them pre-cleared through the Justice Department. So it sues and says that Congress just doesn't have the authority to have this pre-clearance. And Chief Justice Roberts writes this decision. And Chief Justice Roberts essentially says, you can't treat states differently. You can't, at the time, it was okay. Whoops, looks like my my HDMI is acting up. Oh, there we go. At the time, they were extraordinary times. The amount of discrimination was rampant. And so sort of desperate times allowed desperate measures. But it's 50 years later, And, some of these counties have come a long way. Obviously, the program has worked. In many of these counties, the numbers of persons of color voting are as high on a percentage basis as others. So this is now unconstitutional. You've exceeded the authority that it originally provided for. So in a way, it's saying the only reason we allowed it to begin with, or the only reason it was constitutional to begin with, was because of the times. But the times have changed. Controversial claim, obviously, and that's why this was all over the news. And RBG writes the dissent and says, well, the only reason why things are better is because we have this pre-clearance system, and it's been working, and now you want to take it away. But her biggest problem was that this is policy. It's kind of interesting. Remember I said, when it comes to the Constitution, we're all hypocrites, okay? Listen to the arguments here, okay? What Roberts does is he takes the decision out of the hands of Congress and says that the court should be deciding it. That's a very non-originalist argument, because the courts are given the right to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, not the courts necessarily, okay? And what is Ruth Bader Ginsburg arguing? Who's a non-originalist? What's she arguing? An originalist argument, which is what? This should be left to Congress. Congress is answerable to the people, not the courts. We shouldn't be making this decision. This is a policy decision. This should be Congress. And this happens all the time. I mean, if you really read these cases, it's going to drive you crazy if you're an ideologue, if you believe, that you should follow one particular theory. Sometimes they'll flip and they'll argue each other's ideological, perspectives to support the outcome of the case. What's that? Yeah, as Teddy said, except Thomas, and that's actually true. So whether you like or dislike Thomas, I don't care, one way or the other. That won't count for anything in this course. But whether you like him or dislike him, he is about the most consistent. He really does stick to his ideology. There's no doubt about that. All right, let's talk about the 11th Amendment, which is a notion of sovereign immunity. And all I'm going to do here today is get you guys sort of warmed up on some of the principles of the 11th Amendment, okay? We're not going to do any of the cases right now. I just want to get the basics down, and then we have a whole bunch of cases we're going to run through on Thursday and wrap up the 11th Amendment on Thursday. The 11th Amendment was enacted shortly after the Bill of Rights it actually wasn't enacted, it was ratified. Not long after the Bill of Rights was ratified. Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments were ratified in 1791. And the 11th Amendment was ratified in 1795. Now, times are different, and you guys have had torts, and you guys talked about sovereign immunity in torts, I assume, to some degree. And the 11th Amendment is a principle of sovereign immunity. It essentially kind of mixes together the notion of state sovereign immunity with federalism, okay? And so what it says is that, back in the late 1700s, states thought they had every right in the world to have strong sovereign immunity laws. And, this is because we just haven't advanced as far as a society. we didn't have as developed methods of insurance and things like that. So the original idea of sovereign immunity, as it came out of England, is that the King of England was the representative of God on earth, and you can't sue God. It wouldn't be right. So therefore, you can't sue the government, which the King of England or the Queen of England gets to control. And then it expanded to notions of the government not wanting to be responsible for isolated, stupid acts of government officials, because it wasn't really the officials themselves who would pay the price for it. It would be the taxpayers who paid the price for it. And why should government be put in that position? And then, of course, as time went by and as tort law changed, you guys probably learned that a lot of states started getting rid of their sovereign immunity laws, not fully, but to some degree, started passing state statutes. We have a Federal Tort Claims Act, which abolishes a large part of federal sovereign immunity. That was enacted in the 1930s. Massachusetts did not enact its State Torts Claim Act until the 1970s. So Massachusetts has taken steps to abolish sovereign immunity. But when the 11th Amendment was obviously became law and grafted onto the Constitution, government was pretty clear in its desire to keep the notion of sovereign immunity. And that's what the 11th Amendment is recognizing. And this is because this Chisholm versus Georgia case came down that found that Chisholm could sue the state of Georgia in a federal court, and Georgia went crazy. This is a violation of our sovereignty. We shouldn't be held into a federal court to answer for federal law. This isn't right. Shortly thereafter, the 11th Amendment was really kind of ramrodded through. And here it is, right here, the 11th Amendment. It's short. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against any one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. Now, if you look at some of the big operative words, against one of the United States by citizens of another state, the Supreme Court has effectively taken the word another out and put in the word any. So it's a lawsuit that's by a citizen of his own state or another state. Okay, that state is immune from suit in the federal courts. And Justice Souter, David Souter, disagrees with what I just told you that the Supreme Court has done. And I don't know why the Supreme Court has done it. He says, you know what? This is really, the word another had import, and all the 11th Amendment really is a diversity of citizenship rule when another state is the defendant instead of the state where the plaintiff lives. So he's saying this sovereign immunity should only apply when it's the citizen of one state suing a state other than the one that he lives in. And I think his is a more literal interpretation of the 11th Amendment. All right, let's get down our rules. You ready? Write these down. And I'm going to give you a quick quiz. It's not going to count. Number 1, 11th Amendment immunity applies only when a state is a defendant, not when a political subdivision of the state is a defendant. Counties, cities, and towns are political divisions. There is no 11th Amendment immunity when the defendant is the town of Andover. Okay? There is 11th Amendment immunity when the defendant is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or the state of New Hampshire. Got that? Plaintiff must be a private party, either an individual or, a corporation or some other entity like an LLC or a partnership or something like that. The defendant must be a state. Doesn't work when the plaintiff is a state and the defendant is a person. Plaintiff must be a person, in the big sense of the word, and the defendant must be a state, not a subdivision of the state. Massachusetts versus New Hampshire. Is New Hampshire sovereignly immune? Nope. Plaintiff is another state. It doesn't work. William Smith versus Chicago, Illinois. Is William Smith an individual? Yeah. Chicago, Illinois is a state, right? No, Chicago, Illinois is a city, a political subdivision of a state. 11th Amendment immunity does not apply here. Okay, you got to know the difference between a city and a state. I think you all do. Long time ago, the Red Sox used to have a pitcher named Oil Can Boyd, and he was a piece of work. He was a very good pitcher. And they went up to Cleveland and they played a game in then what was the old municipal stadium, which was right on Lake Erie. And apparently the game literally got fogged out. And do you know what Oil Can Boyd said? That's what you get for building a stadium on the ocean. You guys know Lake Erie is not the ocean, right? It's a lake. So know the difference between states and cities and states and counties and things like that, okay? Okay, Maine versus William Smith. Sovereign immunity? Plaintiff ain't a person. It's not a corporation or a person or an entity. You got to have the plaintiff as a person or an entity, not a state. Bill Smith, a citizen of New Hampshire versus Massachusetts. Sovereign immunity. Massachusetts will get the case dismissed, okay, because it's now a person who's bringing it. I'm going to leave you with I got a couple of slides here giving you the 3 exceptions to sovereign immunity, to 11th Amendment immunity. And then I'm going to get you out of here about 10 minutes early, I believe. The third one is the one we're going to be doing. It's the one you're going to see on the bar exam. It's the one you're going to see on my exam, okay? First, the states may consent and waive their right to immunity. This is usually done through state tort claims laws. The waiver must be unmistakably clear. It will not be implied from silence or acquiescence, okay? So when a state clearly and unambiguously waives its right to immunity, it is not immune. And once again, these are usually done through state tort claims laws that the state legislature passes. 2, you may see this once in a blue moon tested on the bar exam, but not very often. You can sue a public official in their individual capacities as long as the state is not going to pay out of its own treasury. We are later going to talk, when we do First Amendment, we're going to talk about McCullen versus Coakley. You guys know who Martha Coakley was? She was the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the Commonwealth. And that suit was again about an abortion clinic buffer zone law that Massachusetts had. McCullen was not suing for money, and she wasn't suing the state, she was suing the individual responsible for enforcing the law in her individual capacity. This is something, if you're going to do constitutional claims, this is something you have to be cognizant of. Don't sue the damn state. Sue the person who's going to enforce. And all she was looking for was an injunction and declaratory relief. She wasn't looking for monetary damages, okay? But this is the big one right here. Congress can waive the immunity on behalf of the states through the enforcement powers of Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. Okay? This is the one you're going to be tested on. But it's not just any case that's claimed to be under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. It's got to be a big case, one that involves racial discrimination, gender discrimination, violation of a fundamental right. And I'll explain these all to you. I'm going to introduce you to the levels of scrutiny and individual rights you're going to be seeing, because this is going to help you understand this. When we come back on Thursday, we're going to review strict scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, and rational basis scrutiny, okay? But we'll do those when we come back on Thursday. You guys have a good day and stay safe, okay?
Can I ask a quick question, maybe?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
was just gonna ask you if we're gonna get any review before the final.
I
That's
don't do review. I don't believe in reviews. They're a colossal waste of time,
all. Okay,
okay?
all right.
I do Zoom office hours. You know how many people came into my Zoom office hours on last Wednesday? Exactly 0. You know how many came on the Wednesday before? 2. And they asked a bunch of substantive questions. So, you know, every Wednesday at 11:30 and 6:30, I do Zoom office hours. And I'll be happy to discuss substantive matters then.
Okay.
So I sent out a reoccurring one.
Well,
So go back
Professor-
and look for my email.
Yeah, Professor, I sent you an email. This is Jade.
Yep,
Because I couldn't do them within the time frames that you had.
okay. So
So-
Jay, did you ask me for another meeting time?
Yeah, I sent you an email yesterday.
Okay, I'll take a look for it, Jade, and I'll
Okay.
respond to you,
Okay,
okay?
thank you.
Okay, you bet.
Thank you.
Thank you.